Hello fellow YouTube friends, followers, fools and flabbergasters, my name is Mason and it's time for more efficiency in gearing in PvE. It's been a while since I last made a build video due to the summer balance patch coming up, and I'll start updating the older videos first once it happened, so there will be more content coming. Now, why did I decide to make this video? Well, because I constantly see players around me fall into gearing traps in Guild Wars 2. In several discords and on the build guide videos you repeatedly see comments popping up like, I use gear suggested in this guide video and I want to do fractals, raids or strike missions. These players then realize that the intention of the guide they followed is not consistent with their own intentions, or maybe it was only at the time when they watched the guide video, but their intentions have changed since then. This is not very efficient, neither in terms of the time investment nor in terms of the gold spent. So in this video I wanted to provide guidance on how you can gear up your character more efficiently by asking yourself a few basic questions and planning before you even start. This video isn't only aimed at newer players, by the way, it's also meant for content creators because we as information intermediaries in the game have responsibilities. That sounds a lot more serious than it's intended to sound though. I'm not going to provide full details on all the gearing options here because there's a really well written guide on the wiki done by Tanetris for gearing up a character. I'll also link that in the description. It's not really updated for End of Dragons thoroughly, but End of Dragons doesn't provide many new gearing options anyway. In case you're equipped with mostly legendary gear already, this obviously doesn't apply to you, since your switching costs are always low anyway. For anyone else, let's try and make your life easier. Before we start, let's define what efficiency is. Efficiency is the ability to produce an intended result, like gearing up a character for PvE, in the way that results in the least waste of time, effort, and resources. So you have a fixed goal and you want to get there with a minimal effort. Effectiveness, on the other hand, is producing the best result with a given amount of effort. So there's a slight but important difference. The process I suggest consists of 4 steps, and step 1 is defining your own goals. The main question you should ask yourself first is, what content do I want to play, especially in the long run? You'll probably want to at least have the option to do all kinds of content at some point, and that's why many open world guides out there don't really provide very efficient builds for you because they are inflexible. They imply that your goal is to never do anything besides open world in PvE, because if they assumed anything else, they'd have to change the builds they suggest. I could provide lots of examples here, but you just have to look for an open world guide on any elite spec and you'll see several of them. This isn't meant to trash talk other guide videos, not at all, but it's clear that that approach is not very useful in Guild Wars 2, especially since most open world content doesn't even require a dedicated build to complete it quite effectively. Instead, it makes more sense to use raid or fractal builds as a starting point and gradually build for survivability until you're comfortable in open world. This means that instead of buying a full set of Trailblazer armor for 80 gold or more as the main gear set, only buy the large pieces one by one and only when you feel like they are needed. The smaller pieces of armor, by the way, only provide a very small fraction of stats compared to the chest, amulets and weapons anyway. Aside from that, basically every class has traits that makes you very survivable without changing your gear much or even at all. You'd be surprised how much of a difference trait choices can make. We'll talk about this again later in step 4. And finally, as the third option, you can always change your food and utility item for defensive attributes. These points do not only apply to full DPS builds, they also apply to quickness or alacrity support builds in the very same way. They are very much sought after in any kind of content in open world, and you're the hero of meta events if you do good damage and provide this kind of support as well. Now you might ask, but what if I also want to do PvP? You should never expect to be able to run the same gear for PvP and PvE in any MMO, because the requirements for these two game modes are vastly different. This is reinforced by the fact that in Guild Wars 2 you only carry over your PvE gear to one aspect of PvP, and that is world versus world. In structured PvP your gear is standardized anyway, so world versus world is the only mode you would be making a strong compromise for. That said, unless you want to go for competitive and min-max world versus world over longer time periods, you can use the same approach as you do in open world. Start with a full PvE damage build and increase utility and survivability gradually. Again, you can gain a lot of survivability by just changing some gear pieces, traits and food. I never felt the need to do more when I did world versus world. This of course depends on your goals, but in my opinion it makes more sense to go about it this way as a newer player compared to having a gear set for open world and world versus world, and then having to buy another full gear set for instance PvE or meta events. So take a second and think about what your intentions are, and then evaluate whether the guide videos you've been looking at actually match your intentions. Once you define your goals, you can start actually gearing up, which brings me to step 2. Looking at budget options in exotic or rare quality as a filler for your final build. Since Ascendant and Legendary gear takes time to acquire, you need something you can use until you get it. A mix of exotic and rare gear is totally fine for that, since the difference in effective power is not that large. Usually between 10 and 20% depending on the build. Only higher tier fractals require Ascendant gear due to agony resistance. For open world, it's not gonna make or break a build if you don't fully max out your crit chance or condition duration, for example. You'll have a harder time doing that in exotic or rare gear anyway. So what you can do is you can go with budget options from the trading post. Power builds can buy cheap Berserker gear off the trading post, as cheap named items for all 3 armor weights and weapons exist. So it makes sense to use a power build for starters, even if you intend to go for a full condition build afterwards. This way you'll only need around 20 gold for the entire gear set. We'll pair the Zerker gear with Eagle runes and Sigils of Accuracy and Fire, so you can get close to the crit cap even with exotic gear. Armor including runes costs around 5 gold in total, weapons will be around 1 to 3 gold depending on which ones you need. Trinkets in exotic will cost a bit more, which is why we use rare quality stuff, since it only costs a fraction of it. You'll need Berserker stuff on level 80 in rare, make sure to use the correct filters. The back item you can craft easily yourself, just go for a crafting profession backpack like the Elegant Weaponsmith's backpack I'm showcasing here. If you don't have that crafting line leveled, you can also buy one off the trading post. You can then put a ruby jewel into all of the trinkets at the cost of another 3 gold. This way the entire gear set will cost you as much as 1 or 2 pieces of alternative gear, and you'll be able to do your fair share of damage in instant content already if you do some rotation practice. That's because other stats like Viper, Diviner or Ritualist are a lot more expensive. The cost efficient option for those is to farm stat selectable armor, like Verdant Brink meta for the bladed armor boxes if you have Heart of Thorns. There's also a few stat selectable pieces from the trading post like the Ice Golem's Maw box for around 1 gold, which are often cheaper than buying the standard exotic pieces of the respective attribute combination. There are lots of other options, but I'll redirect you to the wiki article for more detailed information here. Have a look at it, it includes many good options for both power and condi builds. When you have your interim setup, you can look at efficient ways to acquire Ascendant items for the instanced PvE setup of your choice, which brings me to obtaining Ascendant gear. Ascendant gear doesn't have to cost much, it often just takes a little bit of time to acquire. Some pieces you can buy for relatively cheap. The Ascendant Amulet Vial of Salt, for example, doesn't cost much more than any exotic piece of Trailblazer, Viper or Ritualist armor, like 20 gold, and is stat selectable while providing a large chunk of your stats. There are also weapon collections for the elite specs. These take a little bit of time and effort, but they reward you with Ascendant weapons of pretty much all types with comparably low effort. The only downside is that you need to level the respective class to 80 to unlock them. And since the tasks they require include stuff you often do anyway once you level 80, they are a great way to obtain your first Ascendant weapons. But trinkets make up for almost half of your entire stats, which is why these should be the first thing to focus on. Stat selectable Ascended trinkets come from living world zones, like Bitterfrost Frontier and Dragonfall both provide options to consistently farm their currencies and allow you to get a full set of trinkets within a few days. The Winterberry farm in Bitterfrost can be done with multiple characters on the same day, while Mistborn Mode's farm in Dragonfall can be done on one character repeatedly. Bloodstone Fen is also worth a mention here, since it allows you to reset the stats on all the items you get there, but it's slower than the other options. These Living World chapters cost a bit of gold or gems, but they are definitely worth it for the easy access to Ascended trinkets, so I can only recommend getting them in the long run. With your interim setup, you can also do strike missions, raids or lower tier fractals, which will award you with currency that allows you to buy Ascended gear that's also stat selectable. They further have chances to drop Ascended armor or weapon boxes directly, even though you shouldn't rely on those since the drop chances are rather small. Fractals also reward you with pristine relics, which you can use to buy Ascended trinkets too. And finally, of course, there's crafting. I'll also redirect you to the written guide for this though. Also keep in mind that you can stat swap Ascended armor and weapons in the Mystic Forge for relatively cheap, so even items that don't allow you to select the attribute you want can be changed to it afterwards. In either case, so with exotic or Ascended or a mix of both, you should always build for open world survivability efficiently. Building for survivability in an efficient way for open world includes a few essential elements and can be done through various means, but it always focuses on outlasting or avoiding incoming damage. That can be done by increasing toughness, vitality or damage taken reductions, by generating large amounts of self-healing, or simply by avoiding damage in the first place, for example by using lots of evades or being at range. Guild Wars 2 builds are quite complex, so I can understand that it's hard to wrap your head around them right now, but that's what good build guides are for. Overall, which way of building for survivability is more effective depends on the class, and it's hard to give general guidance. But most meta battle open world guides give you several alternatives, which is why I can recommend to have a look at them. Generally, you should try to identify traits that have a worthwhile trade-off for the loss in damage for whenever you need survivability. Let's use the Vindicator traits Forerunner of Death and Vassals of the Empire as an example. Forerunner of Death makes it deal 15% increased damage for 15 seconds after dodging and also applies vulnerability, so it can yield an even higher damage increase. Vassals on the Empire, on the other hand, doesn't provide that, but it provides area protection, might, and also extends all boons on allies by 2 seconds. It therefore does not only provide a large amount of survivability through permanent 33% strike damage reduction, but it also has a good chunk of group utility through boons built in, and also boosts damage if you don't have other external sources of might. A trade-off that can be very much worth it if you're struggling to survive or want to help allies around you. Now, you can also of course swap armor pieces, but there's no real point if you can also save all the money by just swapping out traits or utility skills one by one until you're comfortable. You can do the very same thing with stun breaks, blocks, Condi cleanses, evades, etc. Before you look at exchanging gear, have a look at your weapon or utility options and try to find something there instead. That also leads to you learning the class better instead of just exchanging gear and button mashing randomly. As proof that this strategy can work, in the video running in the background you can see me soloing a champion hero point with the interim gear listed above on a core warrior build, focusing on self-healing by stacking might on itself with quite good damage for solo gameplay, to be honest. Now that doesn't mean that exchanging traits or skills only is best in slot. Condi builds, for example, can exchange their small strike damage portion for a sizable increase to survivability by swapping a few stat heavy gear pieces. Because Condi builds, aside from a few exceptions, yeah, looking at you Condi Virtuoso, they only need Condi damage and expertise to deal the majority of their potential damage, while power builds need power, precision and ferocity, so 3 stats instead of 2. In the end, it's up to you how efficient you want your gearing process to be. I had to make mistakes myself before I learned these things, so I hope I can prevent some other people from making the same mistakes that I did. Wrapping it up, I hope that this video was insightful for you and made you think about your gearing process. Feel free to like and subscribe for the YouTube algorithm. See you next time and happy winterberry farming.